How's it going, everyone? In this video, I'm going to talk about should you prioritize happiness over everything else? So, I got a really interesting question, which is basically asking what I said, should you be prioritizing happiness over everything else? And actually, at the core of my philosophy, I do think that's true, right? I don't think there are things that are going to serve you better than optimizing your happiness and really putting that at the forefront of what you do. Now, the problem with what I just said is that most people are going to take that in a way that's different than what I mean, right? I have a very specific definition of what I mean by happiness. And to me, at the core, happiness is essentially the number of instances, the number of moments that you evaluate that are positive, right? Or up to a certain degree as positive as they can be. And so I think what happens is a lot of people will take this idea at face value that you should prioritize happiness over everything else and think things like, oh, well, this doesn't make me happy right now. I shouldn't do it. I should never do it. And it's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced than that. So I think one of the first things that comes to mind is basically this idea that, whatever makes me feel good right now is going to be the right thing to do. And when people prioritize happiness in a very hedonic way, right, basically just searching for whatever pleasure they can get in the moment, most of the time these strategies are not going to work in any way in the long term. So one of the first things that you need to think about is how these particular actions are going to affect you overall. So one of the examples personally that has had a big impact is drinking, right? There was a long period which I thought, oh, I get drunk, I really enjoy that experience, it's nice, so to optimize my happiness, I'm going to keep doing that, right? What I didn't account for is basically the holistic picture there. And for me, the relationship a lot of the time was essentially one of, hey, I have this hour or two that is enjoyable, maybe. But then I have, the nights where I end up drinking too much. And then there's, 5 hours in that same night where I don't feel good. And then the whole next day where I don't feel good. Then that's just on a very baseline level of like, how do I feel, right? Then there's these other implications of my physical fitness, among other things. And so, I hadn't really considered things like, oh, this is hurting my body. This is making it hard for me to build muscle. This is making it hard for me to lose fat. This is pushing me towards choices where, again, if I drink too much, I end up having foods that I don't want, so that I end up having lower nutrition than what I'm looking for. So something that on the surface seems like a really good idea, and there are a bunch of different things that fall into this category, may not be something that actually optimizes happiness, right? When I looked at my general relationship with drinking, a lot of the times it was not optimizing happiness. And I think that's something that people need to really think about, right? Because it's like, oh, well, what makes me happy is eating ice cream all the time. Okay, but if you're also trying to stay in shape and want to be able to do things like go on a hike and feel good, you can't just constantly be putting garbage into your body. And there are, again, a number of ways that this can kind of happen. So that's one of the things to think about when you're prioritizing happiness, is to actually think about, okay, for the actions I'm prioritizing, what is the holistic impact on my life? And I'm not saying you should never eat ice cream, you should never drink, right? These are things that have a place, but it's the relationship that you have with them and the way that you interact with them and the outcomes that you're having and the holistic picture that needs to be taken into account. Now, the second piece that I feel like gets missed a lot is, thinking of happiness again in this really hedonistic, pleasurable way, is that purpose is not really being accounted for. And I think maybe one of the best ways to think about this, or at least the way I like to think about it, is if I am the best version of myself, right? The optimal version of me, whoever I think is the best, most successful, whatever else, the person that I would like to be, that I aspire to be. And I think about the types of activities that this person undertakes. Well, most activities, they're going to have some sort of purpose, right? Some sort of outcome. Now, that doesn't mean that I want to spend 100% of my time just working on certain projects or on a business or whatever else and throw everything else in the trash, right? Never watch TV, never do anything that wastes time or waste time. or is pleasurable. But what it means is that that's an important component in life. And I have had periods, and likely you have had these as well, where you're not really accomplishing anything. Nothing is really tied to purpose. You're maybe doing a lot of pleasurable things, or you're trying to use pleasurable things to fill some of the gaps, and it just doesn't really work, right? So another thing that really needs to be considered when you're prioritizing happiness over other things is whether or not you're going to feel fulfilled, right? Because for most people, at some point, that's going to become a piece of what it is that you consider as you're looking at your happiness. So again, I think it's reasonable to prioritize happiness over everything else. But realistically, when you think about it, when you think about happiness, what you're actually optimizing for is overall well-being and the quality of your entire life. And then when you get to that, it becomes a lot more broad, right? Because when you have this, surface level of idea, like, I'll just optimize for happiness, and if I don't like this job, I'll quit, and if I don't like this person, I'll leave them, and if I have a craving, I'm just going to immediately give into it, right? When you get the more holistic picture and you start thinking about these other things, you have to realize that not everything can be optimized for happiness in the moment, because that doesn't necessarily produce the best results. The third consideration that I think a lot of people miss is that you may have to do some difficult things to increase happiness overall. So, going back to this purpose piece, you may have to do some hard, challenging tasks and do that to feel fulfilled, which may temporarily decrease, maybe physical comfort, right? Maybe you have to go to the gym and physically it's not comfortable, but increase your happiness overall because that discomfort is moderated by the fact that you have a purpose for the action you're taking. Now, this is going to start to sound a little bit complicated, and it is, but it isn't, right? It's complicated in the sense that this is not necessarily the way that people intuitively think about happiness. Many of them. Some people do. But the way that it's simple is that basically what you're looking for is quality of life, right? What you want is overall well-being. That's realistically what happiness is, right? So if you keep plastering over the things you have to do with things that are not as useful, and you end up building happiness debt, right? And at some point you have to pay that back. So when you say something like prioritize happiness over everything, you still have to invest in a bunch of other things that may or may not make you happy in the moment, right? So for example, if you're in a relationship that has value, right, that you want to maintain to some degree, and you're prioritizing happiness, you don't just leave the relationship the minute something isn't working out. That's not optimal for what it is that you want to actually accomplish. You have to get in and do some of the work and do some of these unpleasant things to optimize happiness, to prioritize happiness. So in a sense, it's hard for me to think about other things that don't optimize happiness that you would want to prioritize, right? Like there's some things that I think are traps that people commonly fall into. So things like, for example, following kind of blindly the wishes of your parents or what you think society wants or something like that, because you think that maybe that's right in some way. Now, to me, I don't think that makes sense, right? I don't think it makes sense to follow some of these things that don't optimize your happiness. So that's more or less kind of the baseline that I have, right? Is you should prioritize happiness over everything else, but what that entails is usually a lot more broad and a lot more nuanced than what it looks like on the surface. Because again, going back to like, oh, do I want to make my parents proud? Okay, well, how important is making your parents proud on a purpose scale compared to doing something that you actually want to do or exploring this passion or whatever? And most of the time, I think those variables are going to weigh out in a way that it doesn't make sense to prioritize that particular thing. But in every circumstance, it really depends, and you really have to weigh out all the variables and what the outcomes are going to be. So hopefully that helps kind of clarify some of the thinking around, at least where I'm coming from. I do think you should prioritize happiness over other things, but you really need to consider all of the implications of your actions, because just going at the surface level of like, oh, I can just do things that make me feel good, just do things that make me feel good, is not going to work out in the long term. And the other piece is not considering this purpose piece in the way that you kind of make these choices is going to end up with negative consequences at some point. So let's move on to the reflection questions. 1. Are there any activities that increase your happiness now, but will decrease them over time? 2. What activities do you do that may not be pleasurable, but are purposeful and bring you happiness? 3. What are some ways that you could better prioritize your happiness? So that's all I've got for this video. Again, hopefully it kind of gives you a little bit more of an idea of how to prioritize happiness without really making some of these surface level mistakes that do happen. I mean, I've definitely gone through phases where I'm paying out in the wrong ways. I'm focused on the wrong things, thinking I'm chasing happiness in a way that doesn't actually produce it in the long term. So that's all I've got for this video. As always, if you have any questions, comments, topics you want me to cover, put them down in the box below. I'll get to them as soon as I can, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe, as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.